Well, welcome to this session of the International Agreements Committee in the House of Lords. We have this afternoon the Right Honourable Liz Truss, MP, who's the Secretary of State for International Trade, together with the Director General of Trade Policy, Mr. John Alty, coming to give evidence to us, particularly about the trade negotiations which are taking place. So I look forward to seeing Ms. Truss and Mr. Alty, which I don't at the moment. I do now. Secretary of State, welcome to our committee meeting, and welcome Mr. Alty as well. We're very pleased to see you, and we're looking forward to the evidence session this afternoon. I understand that you would like to make some opening remarks, which of course you're very welcome to do, though I do warn you that the time that's taken will add on at the end to make sure the committee has enough time still to question you. I'm sure that's understood. Please.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you for inviting me to the committee today. And I look forward to talking to you about the important work my department is doing around the world. Clearly, the major priority for the government at the moment is the recovery from coronavirus and getting our economy moving again. More trade and investment is central to that ambition and central to delivering the things that people care about, whether that's better public services, better transport links, better broadband, more high-paying jobs in local areas, and greater choice in our shops. Our re-emergence as an independent trading nation is a major opportunity for us to deliver those things. When we left the EU, we did so with the promise of striking free trade deals with the rest of the world and exporting the best of Britain abroad. My department is working flat out to deliver on that promise. We have hundreds of negotiators working round the clock across 3 continents to strike deals that benefit the whole of the UK. I want to update you on the progress we've made and what our objectives are. First and foremost, we want to re-establish Britain as a fierce campaigner for free trade in this era of increased protectionism. We're doing that through our work at the WTO and through bilateral trade agreements with Japan, the US, New Zealand, and Australia, as well as accession to CPTPP. Our trade policy ultimately aims to do 3 things. Firstly, to deliver more trade and investment, unleashing the benefits of trade post-Brexit and levelling up our country and boosting our economic security. Secondly, to diversify our trade so we are less reliant on certain parts of the world, which will ultimately make Britain more resilient to future crises. Thirdly, to work with like-minded countries to reshape the global trading system. Strategically, our aim is to put Britain at the centre of a network of free trade deals with like-minded allies, to become a networked Britain, not a fortress Britain, and a hub for international business and investors trading with the rest of the world. That's why we're pushing accession to CPTPP up the agenda, alongside continuing work on the US free trade negotiations. CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a high standards agreement of 11 like-minded members who play by the rules. And we believe that UK membership can help build momentum and influence the direction of global trade. It will put us in a position to lead and shape the creation of new rules and standards in areas like digital trade and data. And it will put pressure on the WTO to reform, led by our excellent candidate for WTO Director General, Dr. Liam Fox. It will also strengthen the global consensus for free trade and put us in a stronger position to challenge those who don't play by the rules and force them to up their game. We've made good progress towards joining, and we've had positive discussions with CPTPP members, including Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. On the US, we are commencing round 3 of talks next week, and we are making good progress. But we are very clear that we are not going to sacrifice a good deal for speed. We have expert negotiators who are tabling UK-specific text across the whole agreement to ensure that it reflects our interests. And we are not just going to accept photocopies. of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. We're also not going to budge on our red lines. The NHS remains off the table. Our food standards must not be undermined, and British farming must benefit from a deal. We also want to make sure that every region and nation of the United Kingdom benefits from a deal. And we are certainly not going to accept the US hitting British industries like gin with additional tariffs. Next time I see my counterpart Bob Lighthizer, I will bring him a bottle of British gin to remind him of how good our products are and what the Americans could be missing out on. No one is more outraged than me about these retaliatory tariffs, and I've been speaking to affected businesses this week, and I share their concerns and frustrations. These tariffs are completely unnecessary, and they harm industry on both sides of the Atlantic. We want them removed, and we want them removed fast, preferably through a negotiated settlement. We are taking a tough line with the US. I've raised this on multiple occasions, and I will continue to fight the corner of British business. But at the same time, I will be making the positive case for trade. Too much of our public debate is framed around the negative. I don't come to work every day to lower standards and undermine key industries. What excites me is the idea of striking deals that benefit our workers, our families, and our underserved regions, and that deliver for the whole country. And free trade remains the best way forward for the world and for Britain. It's time for us to be confident and to seize the opportunity in front of us. And I look very much forward to taking the committee's questions.
Thank you, Secretary of State. We'll come, I think, to some of the issues that you've raised in that statement. I just remind everybody, as I think everyone is fully aware, that this session is being broadcast. There will be a transcript, and Secretary of State, you'll have the opportunity to review that before it's finalised. Members may, as you well know, declare relevant interest shortly before they ask their questions. Now, we're adopting a slightly different process for questioning today. So each member who's going to ask questions will have 5 minutes to ask their main question and any supplementals. The time is being noted and recorded, and if somebody gets to the end of their time, I will make sure that they know. So this is to my colleagues, concise questions, and dare I say it, Secretary of State, to you, concise answers would be very much appreciated. So I will start the questions by noting, Secretary of State, what you said about the importance of being positive about trade deals as well. We'll come, I think, back to that question. But can I, first of all, then ask you about the way that Parliament operates in relation to this area? We've recently completed, I know you will be aware of this, a report on treaty scrutiny, working practices. And several written submissions to our trade inquiries have highlighted the need for robust parliamentary scrutiny and indeed greater involvement of Parliament in trade negotiations. And many of those stakeholders we know wrote to you collectively on the 10th of July on this self-same subject. So can I ask you this, what further consideration is the government giving to these issues, in particular for negotiations that are already in flight, such as those with the US and Japan? How will you facilitate parliamentary scrutiny of a UK-Japan trade treaty, for example, if the committee is not to be given time to scrutinise the initial agreement before it's laid under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, under CRAG, on the grounds that it's a rollover rather than a new free trade agreement? There seems to be some confusion about what its status is. It has been described as a rollover, which would seem to imply that certain things do and don't happen. But at the same time, the department says that it's a new trade agreement, which would suggest that the undertaking already given, that it would be laid in time for us to be able to do our scrutiny properly, would apply. So can I ask you, Secretary of State, therefore, tell us, please, how you see parliamentary scrutiny happening in the robust fashion in which I hope we all think it should.
Well, we want to be as open and transparent as possible and engage Parliament as much as possible in our trade negotiations. That's why we set out our plans, and we've followed through in terms of producing a scoping assessment and being clear about our negotiation objectives before we set off on negotiations. And we've done that with the US, with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. We've also committed to publishing a written ministerial statement at the end of each round. And we're also providing information on a private basis where the negotiation, the nature of the negotiations is confidential. We're providing that private information to the International Trade Select Committee, as well as this committee. So we are, I believe, being open and transparent and compare favourably, in fact, to other parliamentary democracies like Australia and New Zealand. And I think we're comparable in our approach to Canada. You mentioned the CRAG process. Of course, the CRAG process enables Parliament to block the ratification of trade deals, which is an important point to note. And also, any domestic legislation relating to those trade deals would also require parliamentary approval. So I think that's a very important role that Parliament plays. I mean, on Japan, because we are seeking an enhanced agreement with Japan, we have produced additional documentation, so the scoping study, the objectives that we've laid out. And time permitting, we would very much want to be able to give it to the committee in advance of laying the trade deal through the CRAG process. The only constraint on that would be time, but it is absolutely our intention to do that.
Well, thank you. That's very important, because I know you appreciate that though CRAG does have its important powers, it's a limited time that the House would have to consider, and both houses indeed would have to consider the trade deal. So it's important we see them as early as we can. So we'd understood from others that there would be a commitment to make sure that we had the text as the final text in good time to be able to perform our scrutiny. And I understand you to be saying you want that to happen, though you're recognising that maybe circumstances where that can't happen.
Quite. I mean, the only issue would be time, but time permitting, we would absolutely want to do that. And as I've said, I'm happy for either Greg Hands or me to update the committee in private to make sure that you have relevant information in preparation of that report, or indeed our chief negotiator, who is Graham Zebedee, on the Japan deal.
Yeah, I get that. I just have some slight difficulty. You said time permitting you do that. Well, in a sense, it's in your hands, because if you give it to us in enough time, then we'll have the time to look at it. So I'm hoping that really amounts to saying, yes, you will make sure that you give it to us in time that we can do our job properly.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just ask you, before I pass the questioning on to someone else, you mentioned, of course, the timing in relation to the Japan deal, which we understand, but there have been press reports suggesting that the idea that the US deal will be done this year are now very much receding. Can you tell us what you think the timing for the US deal is now, please?
Well, we have never publicly stated a timeline for the US deal. And that is very deliberate, because we do not want to be able for our interlocutors to use time pressure against us. Yes. So it's very important, and I made this point in my opening statement, that we don't sacrifice quality for speed. But of course, we want to realise the benefits of a positive deal with the United States as soon as we can. And there are certain time constraints, clearly the US presidential election, yes, the expiration of the Trade Promotion Authority next year. Having said that, we are progressing as rapidly as we can, given that we are doing this by video conference, and we're also doing this during the recovery period of a major pandemic. Yes. So it hasn't been the most auspicious circumstances under which to conduct negotiations, but given that, I think our negotiators have made very good progress.
I wasn't, in a sense, criticising the progress. I was more asking you for a prediction as to when you think the deal will be done. But are you willing to hazard one of those?
Well, it's dangerous to make a prediction, because, as I say, I don't want our interlocutors to use time pressure against us. We want to conclude a deal as rapidly as we are able to, provided we achieve our negotiating objectives in that deal. And that includes various issues from access to government procurement, to protecting our red lines, to achieving the tariff reductions we want to see.
We do understand it's a very big job that you have, and I make it very clear we wish you very well in it. Everyone wants to see the interests of this country advance as well as they can be. I'm going to turn now to Lord Lansley to pick up on one thing that you have already mentioned in your opening statement, the CPTPP. Lord Lansley. You're muted, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I should draw attention to my interest as UK co-chair of the UK-Japan 21st Century Group. Secretary of State, you mentioned pushing CPTPP up the agenda. Could you tell us something about what the relationship is between the CPTPP as an agreement and the bilateral deals that are currently being discussed with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand? To what extent is the CPTPP itself dictating the terms of the precedent bilateral agreements?
We're pursuing the bilateral agreements with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand as good things in themselves. The Japan deal should generate an extra £15 billion of trade. Australia and New Zealand a further £1 billion. But they are also very important strategic partners, and they are key players in CPTPP. So maintaining the agreement of those countries is important, as of course we are also talking to the other members of CPTPP at the same time. So I see these agreements as both good in themselves and as a stepping stone to CPTPP. And of course, many of the issues that we'll be addressing in those bilaterals we'll also be addressing in terms of CPTPP accession. I had a very good meeting a couple of weeks back with ambassadors and high commissioners from the CPTPP countries. They're all in support of the UK acceding, but clearly it's a complex process. We would have to negotiate market access schedules with all 11 members. So these 3 bilateral agreements are important stepping stones for that process.
Right. Can I turn to the Japan negotiations in particular? Obviously, where timing is concerned, there is a particular constraint, which is that if a deal is not in place before the end of the year, we fall out of the EU-Japan agreement at the end of the transition period. To what extent do you currently anticipate that a comprehensive FTA will be able to be agreed with Japan in time for it to be in place before the end of the year? Or are you presently contemplating a more limited deal in that time frame? I think it's referred to as a mini deal. And what would those compromises look like?
Well, again, I won't allow time pressure to be used against us by our interlocutors. I think that's a very important principle. So I'm not going to set a deadline and say we must meet that deadline. I think that would be problematic. Having said that, we are making good progress in our negotiations with Japan. We want to achieve a deal that is EPA plus in many areas. So, for example, a data and digital chapter that the EU were not able to sign up to is a very exciting prospect for our digital industry, which is world leading. I mean, in terms of the number of billion-dollar tech companies, we're third in the world after the US and China. So there is a real chance, I think, to get a very positive deal with Japan. But again, I won't be pushed or bounced into agreeing a deal that isn't in Britain's interests just because of time constraints.
Can I ask, is that EPA plus in terms of tariffs as well? Further tariff liberalisation, further market access beyond the EU-Japan agreement?
Well, we certainly don't want to see any rollback in existing provisions, particularly on agriculture. That's very important. But clearly, if we can make further progress in terms of liberalisation, we'll be looking for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Lord Gold.
Good afternoon, Secretary of State. My question is this. Several of our witnesses have raised concern about the sequencing of UK's negotiations with the EU, the US and other potential FTA partners. What benefits do you see arising out of pursuing these talks in parallel? And are you sufficiently confident that any conflicting demands from potential partners can be resolved by the negotiating teams during talks?
It's to the UK's advantage that we are pursuing negotiations with multiple partners in parallel. The UK is a very sought after market. It's an attractive market that other countries want access to. And that gives us leverage in our negotiations. And I think there's a real fear of missing out from countries who fear that they won't get that market access to the UK market. So we're using that to our advantage in the negotiations that we're currently conducting. Because we've been so clear about our position with the EU, that we're going to have our own independent regulatory regime, it means the areas for potential conflict between the various negotiations we're conducting are relatively limited. However, we do have a very clear process internally to make sure that we are consistent in our negotiating objectives. And we're also working very closely with David Frost's team in Task Force Europe to make sure there's a read across as well in terms of the EU negotiations.
Thank you very much. The news today coming out of those negotiations is that Monsieur Barnier is rather negative as to whether we will achieve a deal. How significant is it to our ability to negotiate acceptable deals with other countries that we first have to agree matters with the EU? Some of our witnesses have indicated that achieving the EU deal is essential for us to move forward with them.
That's not the view that our negotiating partners take. This is something we are negotiating in parallel. We've been clear we're going to have an independent regulatory regime from the EU, and we've been clear on our EU negotiations that we want a Canada-style deal with the EU. And I think Canada is a very good example because Canada is a country that has a good trade deal with the EU, CETA. It's part of the USMCA with the US and Mexico, and it's also part of CPTPP. So that shows to me that it's perfectly possible to negotiate a good deal with the EU and with those other trading partners as well. And that is where the UK wants to be at the centre of a network of free trade deals with like-minded partners.
If you pull off a Canada-style deal or something similar with the EU, then my issue goes away. But the question is, what if we do not manage that?
Well, that is what we want. I think David Frost, you'll have heard his comments on the media earlier saying, why wouldn't the EU want that? And that continues to be our objective. And we work very closely with David Frost and his team at Task Force Europe to make sure that those objectives are aligned with what we're seeking to achieve in our trade negotiations too. But you will have to have David Frost in front of your committee if you want more details on the EU negotiations.
I suspect we will. I wish you very good luck with all of these negotiations.
Thank you.
Well, good. The next questioner is Baroness Liddell.
Thank you, Lord Chair. Secretary of State, I'm interested in the expert trade advisory groups and how your department or how the government goes about balancing the submissions it receives to its consultations and the advice it receives from the advisory groups, where different stakeholders might take opposite views on the same issue. And we already hear from the NFU that they believe that these groups do not provide sufficient opportunity for industry to scrutinise and feed into negotiations, which is a direct quote. But I have to admit, I was rather startled this morning to discover that your department is insisting on 7-year non-disclosure agreements from members of these advisory groups which seems rather unusual, particularly as I understand you will also be able to arbitrarily extend that 7-year period, which is pretty spectacular in itself. What possible purpose could that serve, and what's your reasoning for doing it?
Well, thank you, Baroness Liddell. It's important to note that we have very clear objectives in our trade negotiations overall. And of course, one of them is economic, but we are not going to seek economic gain at the expense of UK sovereignty or the expense of any of our red lines, whether those are on food standards or the National Health Service. So, of course, we're always having to make sure that in any proposition we put forward in any negotiations that we're protecting those core UK interests. So, yes, we look at the economic impact, but we're also looking at those other factors, such as does the UK continue to have a right to regulate? Are we protecting treasured institutions like the NHS? Are we making sure that our farmers remain competitive? On the point you've made about the trade advisory groups, we have frequently meetings with the NFU and other interested parties. And as we go into the next phase of negotiations, those parties will be briefed on the detail of what we are offering and what the counterparties are offering. It's obviously very important that that information remains confidential, because it's not just important for that negotiation we're conducting, but it's also important for any future trade partners that they don't know what the UK's strategy and game plan and offer and internal economics are. And we want to make sure that every sector of our economy, whether it's farming or ceramics or steel, is fully bought into the process. We're able to talk about the detail of the negotiations, but that information is necessarily extremely sensitive and could be very damaging to UK interests should it be divulged. So that is why it's necessary to have non-disclosure agreements so that we can fully share the information to be able to reassure you. And in your earlier part of your question, you said that the National Farmers Union had concerns that they weren't getting sufficient information. What we want to do is bring organisations like the NFU more closely into the negotiations, but that does require a level of confidentiality. Otherwise, the UK's overall trade position and trade policy could be jeopardised. That is the balance that we are trying to strike. We've also established a Trade and Agriculture Commission because this is such a critical issue for our negotiations, and because we're doing these trade negotiations for the first time in 40 years, to look specifically at the issues for agriculture. That's the principles of what we seek to achieve in free trade agreements, but also the positions we take with respect to the World Trade Organization to push UK interests in areas like animal welfare and food safety. So we are doing a lot of work to make sure that the farming industry is very, very closely involved with our negotiations, but it does require confidentiality. That is very important.
The TUC this morning have made the point that because of non-disclosure agreements, it means when an issue emerges relating to a specific industry, it means that they cannot consult their members in that industry. How would you propose that should be dealt with?
Well, I mean, there is information and information, and what we accept are there going to be general discussions about the terms, but what we can't have is specific details of, for example, tariff offers or specific details of our internal economic analysis on specific products emerging into the public domain and therefore giving our interlocutors information.
Just one very quick final point. Could you provide for the committee, obviously given the shortage of time at the moment, it wouldn't be possible to do it, some indication of the kind of criteria that you use to analyse different recommendations and positions put to it? Is it primarily economic, or are there other considerations?
Well, as I said, it's not just economic. We will look at issues of sovereignty. We will look at protecting valued institutions, whether it's public service broadcasting or the National Health Service. And we will also look at making sure a really vital industry like farming is sustainable. And not just that farming overall is sustainable, but the different elements of it are. So we will be looking at detailed economic analysis, scenario planning, price levels between the UK and other countries. These are all things that we will look at in making that judgment.
Thank you.
But ultimately, we are pursuing these trade deals because we want to benefit British business. So this is why we want businesses telling us what would benefit them, what would give them more access to the market. And it's why we are ultimately want to get those points in the final agreements we achieve. Otherwise, there isn't the justification for doing these trade deals. That's the point of them.
I'm going to move on, but it might be because we will have sort of injury time when we've finished all the allotted time to see, and other members can bid for that. And it maybe we'll come back to this slightly difficult issue of non-disclosure agreements. Non-disclosure agreements are always difficult. Lord Kerr.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good afternoon, Secretary of State. I'd like to take you back to the America agreement, please. And I'd like to start with one very specific question and then two general questions. The specific question arises because you talked about gin, and because I'm a Scotsman and the Prime Minister's in Scotland today. And for Scots, the really serious export to the United States is, of course, whiskey, which earns the country over £1 billion a year. Or did until last October, when President Trump, because of the Boeing complaint against Airbus, imposed his 25% tariff on malt whiskey. What are your negotiators doing about that? Are they making the exemption of the UK from these tariffs a precondition for any deal between us and them?
We see this issue of gin and indeed whiskey as being extremely serious. And as you pointed out, Lord Kerr, it's having a very detrimental effect on the industry. This is part of an overall dispute between the EU and the US, of which the UK is a party, as we are an Airbus country. I would point out that Airbus has fulfilled all of its requirements in terms of the original subsidy issue that arose. I've been very clear with the US with these threats of additional tariffs on gin, that would be hugely detrimental to our negotiations. And I think the British public would lose their support for negotiations continuing were there to be additional tariffs levied. And although it's not a part of the negotiations per se, it is a separate track of conversation that I'm having with my counterpart, Bob Lighthizer, to get these tariffs removed as quickly as possible. And of course, from the 1st of January next year, the UK will have its own independent tariff policy. So we will be able to more directly relate into that argument. But I am pushing extremely hard. It's a very frustrating situation from an industry that has got absolutely nothing to do with the original dispute.
Yeah, I understand, Secretary of State, and I hear what you say about gin, but there, of course, we're talking about a potential threat to British export. In the case of whiskey, it's actual, it's not a threat, it's happening. My general points arise from the fact that a number of our witnesses have drawn attention to the rather limited economic gains we can expect from a deal with the United States. Your own analysis pointed to a possible increase in GDP of between 0.07 and 0.16%. How do you plan to improve that? If we take goods first, and come back to services in a second, on goods, doing something on public procurement might help quite a lot. When I worked in America, I was struck by how much transatlantic trade was actually intra-company trade, because, for example, UK companies felt they needed a manufacturing base in the United States if they would have any chance of selling to the US public sector. Are you seeking a UK exemption from the Buy America Act?
Well, firstly, on the subject of economic analysis, even on the current analysis, I don't think a £15 billion increase in trade and a £1.8 billion increase in wages is to be sniffed at. So there are significant economic benefits. But in fact, we've recently asked Professor Tony Venables of Oxford University, to review the economics of our trade deals, because at the moment we don't feel they fully reflect the benefits. And there are three particular areas I'd highlight. First of all, the base numbers are from 2011, and we need a revised analysis based on the post-COVID economy. Secondly, we don't feel that the current analysis fully captures the benefits in terms of services, and particular data and digital, which is a key part of our negotiating objectives. And the final point I'd make is about protectionism. We are living in a world where trade barriers are going up. So free trade agreements aren't just about the upside benefit. They're also about protecting against the downside benefit or the downside loss of increased tariffs or increased barriers to trade. So the work that Professor Venables is carrying out is looking to review the economics on that broader basis. But to come to your specific question about procurement, Lord Kerr, you are right, that is a significant opportunity. The US procurement market, government procurement, is currently worth 1.4 trillion. At the moment, the UK only has access to a third of that market. So yes, we want to see positive movement on government procurement, and we also want to see that at a state level. And states are able to opt in to that government procurement chapter, which will be an important part of what we're looking for in the negotiations.
Lord Kerr, I'm going to ask you to save any further questions for injury time, if I can, so that others can get in with their questions. Lord Watts.
Secretary of State, we understand that the US Treasury Secretary has said that any future trade deals will require a non-market country clause. Does that mean that we will have to choose between China and US with our close relationship and trade deals? And if not, what do you mean?
Well, I'm not going to accept any clauses in any trade agreements that limit the UK's sovereignty or our room for manoeuvre with trading partners. I mean, we make those decisions as the UK, and in the same way we've left the EU because we want to make those decisions. We don't want to outsource them to anybody else. I think that's a very important principle. But on the specific subject of China, I do share some of the US's analysis about the issues with China at the World Trade Organization, particularly in areas like transparency, state-owned enterprises, subsidies, intellectual property. And there is important work to do in terms of encouraging all parties at the World Trade Organization to play by the rules. But that should not limit the UK's ability to make our own decisions about our trade policy.
So, Secretary, just to be clear, that will mean our red line is that we will not enter into a trade agreement with America if it insisted on that non-market clause.
Well, what I've said, I'm not going to comment on specific text, because in the same way as I don't want to comment on tariff offers, I think it's very difficult when all of our interlocutors around the world are no doubt watching this committee take place. But what I won't sign up to is anything that limits the UK's sovereignty or our ability to trade with who we want to trade with.
Okay, thank you, Secretary of State.
Let me just follow up on that, because, of course, Secretary of State, you don't give away your sovereignty by agreeing something with somebody. So I'm not quite sure why that answer prevents you from giving a rather more direct answer to Lord Watts. Would you be prepared to have a trade agreement which actually included in it a clause like like what's called the China clause in the USMCA, clause 3210. Do you have a position on that?
My position is that we shouldn't be limiting our room for manoeuvre. And I'm not advocating, by the way, that the UK does this. There are certainly ways in trade agreements that you can give up sovereignty and the right to regulate. I'm not going to agree to those. But what I'm not going to get into is a live negotiation about the precise terms of our deals with other countries in public.
Well, I think that's not what we're trying to do. But in any event, let's move on now to our next questioner, who is Lord Foster.
Good afternoon, Secretary of State. You've already referred to our important creative industries, and I just want to touch very briefly on issues around IP, online harms, and data transfer. You'll be aware that Article 19.17 of USMCA severely constrains ability to determine liability for harmful information on digital platforms. If similar safe harbor provisions are included in our trade deal with the US, there is a very real concern that tackling IP infringement and introducing our own online harms legislation will be very difficult. So my question is, do you share those concerns? And since you've already said that you're not prepared to accept photocopies of USMCA, can we assume that you'll ensure that safe harbor provisions are not foisted upon us?
Well, thank you. I was going to repeat my photocopy line, but I won't. I won't now. The important point here is that we have our own online harms regulations, and we're not going to allow those regulations to be affected by our trade deals. We want the ability to protect people online. We want the ability to protect people's privacy online. And that is our negotiating objectives, and we're very clear about that. I might invite John Alty, who's the Director General, just to say a bit more on that subject.
Of course.
Thank you. I was invited to turn my video off at the beginning, so because the quality of the sound was better that way. So if that's acceptable, I'll keep doing that.
That's fine. Hear you well.
Thank you. Yes, so just to follow up on what the Secretary of State was saying, in our published objectives, it did make clear that we were going to ensure that the government maintained its ability to protect users from online harms, and also on the IP area, that we would make sure that we got copyright provisions that supported the UK's creative industries. So I think I would just really reinforce what the Secretary of State was saying, which is on both these areas, the UK has got strong and effective regimes, and we don't intend that they're undermined by the trade negotiations. Thank you.
But with respect, we actually are in the very process of seeking to develop new online harms legislation. So it's not just what existing legislation there is, its future. But given time is short, can I just move on to one other issue? And that is that in relation to personal data flows, we know that vast quantities of personal data currently collected from EU citizens and stored in US servers by the tech giants like Facebook and Google is meant to be protected from improper use by the so-called US EU Privacy Shield. And you'll be well aware, Secretary of State, that following concerns that US companies weren't giving adequate protection to this personal data, the EU Court of Justice has just struck down that privacy shield. So I'd be very interested in what you think are the implications of this decision for our deal with the US.
Well, we're determined to protect data privacy through our deal with the US, as we are to ensure that we have the right to regulate on online harms. And we're working very closely with DCMS as they develop their work on online harms to make sure that anything we're negotiating in our trade agreement is compatible with the work that they're carrying out. So that's an exercise that we conduct across government with a variety of departments, is making sure that anything we agree in our trade agreements is entirely consistent with our domestic position.
But can you just finally confirm that you say that we have got very good protections? The truth is that the EU 27 are expressing real concern about our own ability to protect data. And there is a real question mark around whether we'll get an adequacy agreement with the EU in that particular deal. Are you confident that we can achieve that adequacy agreement?
Well, I would point out, Lord Foster, that Canada has an adequacy agreement with the EU, and it also has a data and digital chapter with the United States. So I don't see those two things as incompatible.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to Lord Maurice Leveran.
Secretary of State, I noted three very important points that you made in your opening statement and later. First, you said British farmers must not lose out on the deal. And secondly, our food standards must be safeguarded. And thirdly, farming industry is closely involved in your negotiations. As a farmers union official when I was very, very young, I welcome that very much. But we've received a large number of submissions relating to farming and food production, expressing concern that British agriculture and our producers would be undercut. How do you assess the relative risks and benefits to UK farmers of what the US is asking for? And how is the government going to ensure that our agriculture is not sacrificed in a deal?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that what the US is asking for is not necessarily what we are going to agree to. Quite the contrary. We will only do a deal that assists British farmers in exporting more of their products and also make sure we protect our standards that we have here in the United Kingdom. How are we doing that? The answer is involving organisations like the NFU and a lot of other groups who export a lot of food products closely in our negotiations through the trade advisory groups. Also establishing the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which is going to look at the issues more broadly. The reality is this is the first time we're negotiating these deals for 40 years. And there's a lot of work to do in terms of the level of discussion about some of these specific issues. But what we do is we look on a case-by-case basis at every aspect of the farming industry to make sure that they are able to be competitive in a situation where a trade deal is agreed. So whether that's the lamb industry, and I pointed out, I think earlier, that the US is the second largest importer of lamb in the world. There's a really strong opportunity for our lamb farmers. Lamb has been banned from the US market now for many years. We want to get that opened up. We want to get tariffs reduced on products like beef and cheese. Again, we think there's a really strong opportunity in the US. So yes, we need to make sure that our farmers aren't undercut. Yes, we need to make sure we protect our standards. I point out that the EU standards are all transferred into UK law through the EU Withdrawal Act. So those import standards are already in our law. But I think we also need to look at the positive opportunities for UK farming as well. And certainly the economic analysis we did as part of the US trade deal shows that farming will benefit from a deal overall.
May I turn to another aspect, Secretary of State? Agriculture is a devolved matter for the four nations of the United Kingdom. And there is a concern that whatever standards are applicable in each one, that they are maintained. How are you involving the devolved administration in the negotiations so that you ensure that their views are taken fully into account and indeed are part of the situation in the United Kingdom that agriculture is devolved?
So we have a group which is run by Minister Hands of ministers across the United Kingdom to make sure that those ministers are fully involved as we progress trade negotiations with partners. We also work very closely, our officials work very closely with the administrations in the devolved governments as well. I will make one point, which is about the internal market. And this is a paper that was released very recently by my colleague, the business secretary. It is very important that products, wherever they're produced in the United Kingdom, whether it's Scotland, England, Wales, or Northern Ireland, are able to be sold across the whole UK. So you're right that, agriculture is evolved in terms of the administration of policies, but it is important we have a consistent single market across the United Kingdom. And that's why we're working closely together on the framework for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Morris. Lord Oates, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I wonder if I could turn to the issue of climate change. The UK objectives for the UK-Japan agreement include securing provisions that ensure both sides meet their climate objectives. Is the absence of this language from the objectives for the UK-US FTA a reflection of unwillingness on the part of the US to engage on climate objectives? I note, for example, that there is not a single reference in their summary of negotiating objectives to climate. And what can you tell us in general about how climate and environmental issues have been covered so far in the discussions with the US?
So thank you. I mean, in our US objectives, we do talk about securing provisions that support and help further the government's ambitions on climate change and achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So we do explicitly refer to climate change in our US negotiating objectives. There are also other environmental issues we're looking at. So, for example, marine plastics, what we can do to reduce those, low carbon goods. And with all our partners that we're negotiating with, we are discussing environmental issues as part of those agreements. And there will be some, New Zealand, I would point out in particular, that are likely to be extremely forward-leaning in that area. And I hope set a global standard for what we can do in terms of the environment in our trade agreements. Of course, we've got a trim-track approach, which is Alok Sharma, as business secretary, is also pursuing the objectives around COP26. So that is the primary track on which we seek to achieve our climate objectives. But I'm absolutely determined that all of our trade deals should be helping us and achieve our environmental objectives and certainly not jeopardizing our net zero 2050 target.
Thank you. I think the point really is not to suggest that our negotiating objectives don't include climate. It's just notable that they don't refer to mutual objectives on climate, which they do in the Japan trade agreement. But I just wonder whether you agree with the conclusion of a report commissioned by the International Chamber of Commerce on climate change and trade agreements, which argued that if we're to restrict global warming to the Paris Agreement target, trade will have to play a central role. And if you do, don't you think we need a shift in international trade architecture to better align it with international climate objectives?
I do think that trade rules need to be modernised for the age we live in now. And the fact is the WTO rules were written in 1995. They don't have enough on the environment. They don't have enough on digital and data. And we need to lead the world in those areas. And that's something the Prime Minister is very committed to. And of course, we are running Dr. Fox, Liam Fox, as our candidate for the WTO Director General role. And that is something I'm sure he will be looking at.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to the out of Sandwich.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome to Secretary of State. My question is about process as well as content. It relates back to question one and what Lord Goldsmith was talking about, mainly Parliament. And then we discussed non-disclosure agreements. But I should declare I've been on the staff and the board of Christian Aid over many years. And I know you're already well aware, if not too well aware, of the concern among NGOs about social, environmental and welfare standards in all our trade agreements, which is quite right. And the new TAC you've mentioned, it may help there. And you've covered climate change just now. But my question is really, do you think the strength of feeling on these issues justifies greater transparency and trust than has happened before in negotiations, and more regular reporting back to Parliament and obviously stakeholders and civil society as already proposed by this committee formally?
I am constantly looking at how we can make sure we're keeping everybody with an interest in trade policy fully engaged and informed as we progress our trade agreements. This is a new thing for the UK after many years of it being an EU responsibility. And I feel as the Department of International Trade, it's our duty to over-communicate and make sure that everybody is involved in those discussions. And that's what we're doing through the Trade and Agriculture Commission. It's certainly something we're committed to doing with the departments. We're looking at, we already hold a lot of meetings and engagement sessions with NGOs, with business, with Parliament. But of course, if there are specific proposals about groups that we haven't met that we should be meeting, I'm extremely willing to hear about that. I think the distinction between those broader updates and those discussions about trade policy with the details of the negotiation is very, very important. Because whilst I am keen to make sure we're receiving the best possible advice and information from business and NGOs as we go into the negotiations, what I can't have is that information going into the public domain and essentially damaging the UK's negotiating position. And that is the issue that's been identified about NDAs. And of course, there's a balance to be struck between what we say in public and the information that is only available to those who've signed NDAs. But the NDAs are important for those who we are bringing into the very, very specifics of the negotiation.
You see, I would go a little further than that, in the sense that some of these NGOs have enormous experience now over 20, 30 years of trade. Obviously, the knock-on effects on developing countries is their key concern, but they, the Fair Trade Foundation, Tradecraft, and many others are now pretty good at what they do. And I'm anxious that you should reach a state of partnership, just as they have a partnership with DFID in their programs. And so I'm just asking for that today.
Well, I'm certainly very happy to make sure we meet them and fully discuss those issues.
Okay. Right, Lord Sandwich. Senator said, I'm going to go to Lord Robertson in a moment, and you're going to be a little bit surprised because he's wearing a seatbelt. And that's because he's coming back from an important family engagement. He'd hoped to get home, but he can't. I don't think it's because he's expecting a very bumpy ride from your answers. But I hope that the road noise is not going to be too bad. Are you happy to take his question, notwithstanding that?
Certainly am, yes.
Thank you very much. Lord Robertson.
The other one, we just keep shadowing it and sure that I...
Well, I can hear the Secretary of State very well, and John Morris on his telephone. My question is about politics. Now, I've been very encouraged by what you've been saying about government policy, but politics in the US is, of course, a rapidly evolving matter with a presidential election in November. Do you think first that a change of president would make life more difficult for you, or do you think it would have repercussions? And Joe Biden is currently looking more likely to win than Trump, but who knows? And second, the TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority, will run out next year. We heard last week from the head of or representative of the US Chambers of Commerce, she didn't think it'd make any difference. but do you think that will make a difference if we have a new TPA?
We're working with both Republicans and Democrats in the United States to make sure there is bipartisan support for a US trade deal. And so far, conversations have been very positive in that both parties, certainly the people I've spoken to, are supportive. And I think it's important that we move things forward on that basis. I'm not going to comment or speculate on the likely results of the US election. The important point is that it's in both the interests of the United States and the United Kingdom to strike an advanced, high standards, comprehensive trade deal to improve the trading relationship with between both countries, which is already very strong. But on the subject of the Trade Promotion Authority, frankly, we've got enough work here in the UK with our own trade bill, which has just passed the House of Commons. And my focus is on making sure that we get our legislation through. I'll let the Americans worry about their legislation.
Lord Rover, you're actually on mute. We can't hear you. If you want to say, if you have a supplemental, can you just make it?
No, I was just going to say I thought it was a very good answer. I didn't have a supplementary, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, good safe journey home is what I can say.
By the way, I can recommend the restaurant.
Right. Well, we'll ask later whether it was British food or not. Now, I've had requests from Lord Kerr and from Lord Lansley to ask supplementals, which I'm going to allow. Before I do that, can I just ask a question myself, please, Secretary of State? Because we've talked a bit about UK and Japan, and the question really is this: preserving business continuity in trade between UK and Japan is crucial for the UK automotive industry. The business model is based on, as you well know, highly integrated supply chains across the UK and the EU. And stakeholders have stated that a UK-Japan free trade agreement should include a clause providing extended cumulation of EU content, and that the UK and Japan should agree to maintaining the rule of origin for key automotive parts and components that were agreed in the EU-Japan EPA. So the question really, and that's the specifics as to what you comment on that, but what is the government doing to ensure that there's no disruption in the UK automotive trade? You've given some very helpful reassurance in the earlier answers about other aspects, but it's very helpful to know what you can say about this.
Well, of course, automotive is an absolutely vital export for the UK, and it's a key negotiating objective with Japan to get at least what we've got in the EPA on automotive rules of origin, but we also would like to see more. So as far as we're concerned, the status quo is a baseline, but in terms of EU content being counted, that is absolutely critical.
Right, thank you. So I've got Lord Kerr and Lord Lansley, and Lord Watts, I think, also wants to come in at that stage, and Lord Foster too. So as long as we've got time, I'm going to start with Lord Kerr, please, and Lord Oates.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I would like to ask you, Secretary of State, about two of your concerns about what happens on the 1st of January at the border. First, your concern that the temporary arrangements from January to July might cause complaints from WTO partners. If they did, how would you handle them? And second, your thought that WTO itself might object to our definition of the UK customs territory if the tariffs that are collected on all imports into Northern Ireland, that's the rest of the world, and imports from Great Britain are in fact the EU's tariffs, if we are in that default position. How would you handle that objection?
Well, I assume, Lord Kerr, that you're referring to a document that was leaked. And I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that I'm not going to comment on the contents of a leaked document. What I will say is that we have very robust plans in place for the border.
I'm sorry, supposing the WTO raise an objection to the definition of our customs territory that's in the Northern Ireland Protocol, what would you plan to do?
Lord Kerr, I'm not going to respond to issues that arise from a leaked document.
Certainly, I was alerted to it by a leaked document, but the issue is a freestanding issue, and I would hope you'd be able to give some sort of answer.
Well, I'm very confident we've got robust plans in place at the border.
Thank you.
Right. Well, let me turn to Lord Lansley.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, the British government's stated objectives in relation to the US deal refer to state-to-state dispute settlement, but not investor-state dispute settlement. Where investments is concerned, it refers to non-discriminatory provisions. Does that mean that it is your expectation that there will not be an investor-state dispute resolution mechanism included in the deal?
Well, this is a negotiation, so of course those matters are under discussion, as are all matters. I would point out, though, that we already have a large number of investment treaties, over 90, with investor-state dispute mechanisms, and the UK has never lost a case in terms of our right to regulate or our ability to implement UK law.
Of course, it is in this area that some of the witnesses have expressed to us their concern that, for example, where pharmaceutical pricing, medical device pricing, and availability or access to medicines are concerned, this is the route by which a US-UK trade deal might impact on UK healthcare. Are you quite clear that such a mechanism, even if there were investor protection mechanisms between ourselves and America, they wouldn't extend to the regulatory system for drug pricing?
Well, it's a key objective and it's a red line that we won't allow the NHS to be damaged, and we also won't allow the price of drugs to rise as a result of any trade deal we strike. So anything that we negotiate within that trade deal will not lead to drugs prices rising. That's a very important red line. And as I've said on the subject of investor-state dispute mechanisms, the fact is that the UK has never lost a case on any of those dispute mechanisms, and we will maintain our right to regulate our services, our domestic services, as we see fit.
I mean, sorry, Chair, just one quick question, because what our witnesses, of course, would say, including those who are speaking from the American standpoint, not just from the UK standpoint, is that the issue isn't necessarily about what the pricing mechanism is, but that there should not be interference in access to medicine. So their presentation is not that they're looking necessarily to impact on price, but to avoid restrictions on access to medicines. Is that, from your point of view, is that also excluded? That if the UK chooses for regulatory purposes to not to make medicines available, that is a UK decision, which is not then available for dispute by US companies?
Absolutely. I laid out the principle earlier on in this committee hearing that we will maintain our sovereignty and our right to regulate. We will protect the National Health Service. That is a key principle that we are abiding by in all the agreements we're negotiating. And I think it's very important to distinguish between other parties negotiating objectives and what we're actually discussing. You know, their wish list is not what's going to happen. What is going to happen is going to be determined by what we are willing to agree to. And I'm not willing to agree to anything that increases drugs prices or reduces availability to drugs or puts the NHS on the table. I'm not going to agree to any of those things.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Secretary of State. I'm just going to make clear, members of the committee already know, but I ought just to declare that as a partner in an international law firm, I do from time to time advise on investor-state relations and dispute mechanisms. Lord Watts.
Secretary, can I take you back to the issue of the gagging clause? Because isn't it the case that your strategies and tactics will become clear in the process of the negotiations with America? And even if you stick to your original view on this issue, isn't 7 years just overdoing any idea that it's required for such a long period of time?
There's a trade-off, Lord Watts, between what we are able to tell people in detail and the amount of confidentiality we require. But detailed information about, whether it's areas like rules of origin, technical barriers to trade, tariffs, are extremely valuable to our interlocutors. And, we are currently negotiating, as you know, with the United States, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. But that is the first phase of our negotiations. I expect us to be negotiating with other partners in the future. And we don't want those other partners in a few years' time to be able to see whether it's the detailed analysis we've conducted, whether it's the specific tariff offers we've given, whether it's quantitative offers. That is highly sensitive information. And what I don't want to do is have a fake consultation process where we don't really tell people anything. That is why it is confidential, because we are telling people serious things that are very, very pertinent to the negotiation. But I think we'll also give industry, farmers and other actors reassurance that we are acting on their behalf.
Secretary says, I understand the need for confidentiality, but I think the point I'm trying to make is 7 years with an extension means indefinite potentially. Isn't that excessive, what's required?
I would make the contrary argument and say, why would somebody want to release detailed information about UK's negotiating position within 7 years?
And I'm at loss, Secretary of State, to know what details of the negotiations are going to be valuable in 7 years' time, plus the extension that you've required as well. But
look, let me give you an example. In our negotiations with the United States, we are looking at prior agreements that they have signed with Korea, with Australia. I'm looking at every single precedent so I can push them and say, you agreed to this with X, you agreed to that with Y, we want that, plus we want more. And that is what every single trade negotiator does. Now, if we had even more details of exactly what the Australians were prepared to offer 10 years ago, or whenever it was that they signed their agreement with the US, that would be very valuable information for us. And I do not want future trade partners of the United Kingdom to be having access to that level of information. Right. This is practice that other countries use when they bring in industry, when they bring in trusted advisors. And I think confidentiality is the right way to approach this.
Well,
I'm not saying, by the way, and this is on really specific commercial aspects of the negotiation. More broadly, we've given updates to both houses on the overview of what's been achieved in given chapters or what we've been discussing. We've given private briefings, not under NDA, to parliamentarians. But what we are talking about here is the really sharp end of the negotiations. And that is not information that we ever want to enter the public domain.
Well, I think perhaps we should move on from this topic. But say for this, Secretary of State, you talked about telling the ETAGs, if I may call them that, your detailed negotiating objectives. I just wonder, would you be willing to share that with us too? I'm not asking to share it on a basis other than one that you're happy with in terms of non-disclosure, but it would help us, I think, if we too were able to see the same detailed negotiating objectives.
Well, I'm very happy to share with you in a private session a greater level of detail, but the negotiation objectives overall have been published for all of our trade agreements.
Well, you're obviously talking about something more than that which has been published, otherwise you wouldn't have a problem with requiring confidentiality promises in relation to them. But thank you for what you just said, and we'll follow that up. On that same point, you talked about Professor Venables and work that he was doing for you. Is that something that will be made public at some point?
It's already been made public.
Thank you.
So we've announced it. We're shortly about to announce the panel that will be assisting Professor Venables, but the announcement was made a couple of weeks ago.
I really meant the results of what Professor Venables does.
Oh, yes, sorry, they will be, yes.
Lord Oates, please.
Thank you. Could I just turn to a question about the implementation of the rollover agreements that we've already agreed to? And I recognise that you may need to write to the committee on this, on the detail of it. Particularly in relation to the EPA signed with the South African Customs Union and Mozambique. I understand that so far only one of the member states has signed that, has ratified that, and I just wondered if you had a view about whether that will actually come into force in time for the end of the transition. And the second thing was the UK agreed to provide contributions to support the implementation of the agreement, but my understanding is those haven't been forthcoming and there are big problems with the sort of technical implementation. So I wonder if you could either comment on that now or take it up and maybe come back to the committee.
I think it would be best if I write to you on that subject, Lord Oates.
Well, Secretary of State, thank you very, very much indeed. You've answered a lot of questions, which we're very, very grateful. I think there are still some questions that I'm going to write to you about on behalf of the committee, but that will be later. But I do want to thank you. You've given some helpful reassurance. I particularly noted what you said about only doing a deal that helps British farmers export more, and about the commitment to maintaining standards that we've been talking about. But thank you for that. We all wish you well in the negotiations, as we've said, and that terminates the public session. I'm going to invite members of the committee then to move to our other platform so that we can continue our private meeting. Thank you, Secretary of State.
Thank you very much. Thank you.